Hello. Good morning.
Good
Good
morning.
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 Good morning. Wow.
Hopefully folks can see my screen.
We can.
So it looks like we have 19 people already, which I think based on the invitation list is a quorum. So why don't we go ahead and get started? And I'm guessing that a few more will trickle in. So today's conversation or discussion will start with a little bit of an overview from me just to kind of frame the questions and get the juices flowing. But I do want this to be more of a brainstorming and information gathering session than a one-way talk, for sure. So I'd like to do a round of introductions, just because we don't all know each other, I think. Then I'll talk a little bit about integrated modeling and what it is I think we're trying to achieve. And of course, it's a sort of a many-armed beast, so you feel free to have a different vision and express that later when we talk about it. And then I'll walk through sort of a guided set of questions about what's in the health domain in terms of concepts and models and structures and how those interact with other areas like ocean physics or socio-economic phenomena. So by way of introductions, let's see, since we can't sort of see each other and go around the circle, why don't we go through the chat list for the panelists. I'll start. So I'm Tom Fitteman. I'm with Ventana Systems. We're a small consulting and software company that does a mix of public policy and corporate strategy. And we also published two software tools for building dynamic models of a pretty general set of phenomena. And actually, I'll show you an example in a few minutes. I got into this domain of integrated modeling back in about 19 when I started working on climate integrated assessment, and did my dissertation on economics of climate change, which was essentially a critique and reconstruction of what is simultaneously probably the most successful and in some ways most destructive climate economy model out there. And since then, I've been working in the same spirit, both on climate energy interactions and also on other things like country modeling for Indonesia and even the same kind of problem in totally different domains. So looking at integrated modeling of dairy commodities or marketing in businesses like pharmaceuticals or even for a company that makes half the bacon for Wendy's in the US. So same tool set, same dynamic models, just applied to very different set of stakeholders and problems. Just given that we have limited time together, let's kind of go around the virtual circle and introduce ourselves. And at least from my perspective, I'd just be interested to hear who you are, what you're working on, and if you want to say something about how that integrates with other domains, that's certainly interesting as well. First on the list is Alessia.
Hi, this is Alicia Ferguson. I'm at North Carolina A&T. I'm a faculty member and a chair here for the Built Environment Department. I am currently on a grant. It's a beaches project. We're looking at exposures for children. We're kind of trying to do it quantitatively, a modeling approach, and the physical health risks. We have in the past proposed to sort of do the same thing for other populations, such as the oil spill workers or for seafood consumers. So I presented on that on Monday, kind of our approach for this population, try to show you how it could be applied to other populations. We're in the middle of it now. One big part of our modeling approach was to really get the activity patterns right for the children. So we're kind of doing an extensive look at children playing on the beach environment. So I'm here to sort of learn from everyone how we can integrate, other factors or aspects into that modeling approach, but to look at other aspects, such as the mental health issue, how health is compromised, how it may affect our modeling approach. That's it.
Thanks. Oh, and I should mention one thing, which is that we are recording this session, but not for public consumption. It's just for note-taking purposes. And I suppose if somebody who couldn't make it, well, for sure, I know, for example, Helena's going to watch the video after because she's tied up in graduation. Okay, Bert.
Okay, thank you. I'm Bert Singer. I'm a professor in the Emerging Pathogens Institute at the University of Florida. Work I'm currently doing, which is quite related to this, is the study of malaria risk in the Amazon basin of Brazil, which is combining evidence from structured social surveys. So these are longitudinal satellite imagery and also ethnography. And you pretty much need all three in order to characterize both the complex transmission patterns and what puts people at risk. So in terms of health more generally, I had a period of about 20 to 25 years also focused on psychosocial epidemiology, and then I was Dean of Public Health at Yale for a span of 6 years. So a long connection with health. I'm also on the GoMRI Research Board.
Thanks. Emily.
Yeah, hi. I'm Emily Mong Douglas. I'm with Louisiana Sea Grant at LSU, and I'm also a member of Sea Grant's Oil Spill Science Outreach Program. As you might already know, we work with a variety of different target audiences, trying to understand what their oil spill science needs are. And those audiences can really be lumped into either those people who need scientific information for on-the-job decision-making, or they're just folks who depend on a clean and healthy Gulf of Mexico. We've worked with maybe about over 2,000 people at this point, trying to understand those needs. And so we have a pretty rich data set to pull information from. I believe Monica Wilson, my counterpart at Florida Sea Grant, shared those questions on Monday before the beginning of the presentations. And so I'm really just here to help inject some of the information we've learned from our stakeholders in terms of their needs, and just any information that we might have from some of the science synthesis that we've done and we've pulled from other core areas as well.
Great, thanks. John.
I'm John Shepherd. I'm an oceanographer interested in climate change, originally trained as a physicist, mostly retired now. But my main experience relevant to this is to do with integrated Earth system models, trying to put oceans, atmosphere, ice caps, terrestrial biosphere and everything together. But I also worked for a long time in fisheries population dynamics, which I think is somewhat relevant too. I'm a member of the GoMRI Research Board, and I know next to nothing about human health.
Welcome to the club. I'm at least in the same boat with you. That's one of the interesting things about doing integrated modeling, is you get to learn about a lot of new domains. Thanks. Cecily. Maybe she doesn't have audio. How about Claire?
Oh, hi, I'm Claire Paris. I'm a professor of ocean science at the University of Miami. I'm a biological oceanographer. I might have a PhD in coastal oceanography and a couple of master in biochemistry and marine ecology. So I am interdisciplinary by nature, and I've been working on coupling atmospheric, oceanographic, and biological models. So the model integration is part of what I do. And in the context of the Deepwater Horizon spill, I've been working on modeling the oil spill since the beginning of the accident. And with my team already working on frameworks to couple the oil spill model with other models for, and like the social economical models, and also right now looking at toxicity levels that would affect human health. So we've been doing this since the past 3 years now, also with the National Academy of Science project that we're looking at fish eclosure, the topic that I discussed on Monday. And I'm happy to participate, helping how to do this very difficult task to integrate all the models for the Deepwater Horizon spill.
Thank you. And incidentally, if you missed the talks on Monday, I sent the link to the webinar in the one of the invitation messages for this session. So it seems that Zoom rearranges the list dynamically here. So I think next is Jeff.
Hi, I'm Jeff Wycliffe. I'm at Tulane University in the School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine. I'm an environmental health scientist, so my expertise is in environmental toxicology, human health risk assessment with a primary focus on chemicals in the environment. I'm also very interested in and have expertise in biomarker measurements in humans and exposure assessment. So some of the work we've done around the oil spill was focused on seafood safety, And I work closely with analytical chemists who have particular expertise in measuring PAHs, which were sort of widely viewed as the compounds that we know probably the most about that are potentially dangerous to humans, and that can be found in crude oil and all kinds of other sources, actually. And we published a couple papers using probabilistic risk modeling to estimate short-term and lifetime risks, either non-cancer or cancer as sort of the outcome. And with that, I'll let the next person go.
Thanks, and apologies for the typo. I couldn't correct it after that happened.
That's okay.
Let's see, Lorraine.
Morning. I'm Lori Baker with the Health Studies section at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and I've been working on HABs for CDC since we first got funding from Congress to share with states in 1998. I also was part of the Oceans and Human Health Center at the University of Miami, and I focused on work on the lifeguards and their exposure to red tide toxins and the health impacts.
Thanks. Let's see, who's left? Aaron. Oh, no audio, looks like, for Aaron.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Hello?
Hi.
Oh, here I am.
Okay,
Hi,
great.
I'm Erin Pulser. Yep, okay. I'm with the University of South Florida. I'm part of the Sea Image Consortium, and we have been analyzing fish that have been collected Gulf-wide for PAHs and a number of other compounds. My background is environmental toxicology and risk assessment. There you have it.
Thanks. And Ryan.
Hey, my name is Ryan Takashita. I'm a scientist with the National Marine Mammal Foundation. We're also leading GoMRI Consortium, the Consortium for Advanced Research on Marine Mammal Health Assessments. And so through that consortium and through the other work the foundation does, we often build integrated models very similar to what we discussed on Monday, where we're moving from exposure, collecting veterinary health endpoints on marine mammals, and then trying to think about how to best build those out into overall health and reproductive effects at the individual level and at population levels. And we're usually relying on data, not just on marine mammals, but the human health literature and other, vertebrate species. Before I was at the foundation, I also worked on and helped manage the toxicity program for the trustees in the Deepwater NERDA. So I'm pretty familiar with a lot of the toxicity testing that was done to help build up their case. And I got my PhD in molecular, cellular, and developmental biology doing cancer research. So I guess that's a little bit of human health, relevance.
Great, thanks. I'm every time I interact with this group, I'm awed by the depth of and breadth of talent here. And I'll just say welcome to our 15 attendees who are listening as well. Okay, so let me just talk a little bit about the framing of the question and how I think the integrated modeling universe works to some extent, and then we'll launch into a discussion to kind of discuss what's in the box and what the connections are to other domains, and in particular, what are the existing resources, models and other things that are around that could be glued together and haven't been yet, and also what are the missing pieces and how do we get those? And incidentally, feel free to interrupt me with questions at any time or comments as well. So our charter as Ventana in this effort is to support the synthesis effort by essentially harvesting information that we can use to facilitate the design of future integrated models, or maybe just extension of existing integrated models that can answer stakeholder questions. And I think it sounds like you're all involved in that already to various extents, because everything is naturally connected to everything else anyway. And we certainly saw examples of this on Monday. So here we have essentially a health model core with a lot of detail on activities and exposure, but relying on a transport model to understand what chemicals are impacting people in the first place. And of course, generating health risks that are of obvious interest from a socioeconomic standpoint as well. Mental health was also clearly a domain that sort of deeply entangles individual dynamics with economic aspects of sort of household welfare and community support systems. And there's potentially lots of feedback there as well. And certainly Claire's work as well, integrated multiple domains, looking at connecting ocean physics both directly to human health and through a pathway of fishery system behavior and therefore economic effects. And you can imagine lots of additional pathways through this space that haven't been modeled yet. In the course of trying to get our heads around the problem, we actually built kind of a quick and dirty interactive network visualization of all the questions in the space. You may have had a chance to play with it. If not, it's online in a tool called Kumu, for which you have a link. So this is a visualization of all of the questions in the spreadsheet provided by Sea Grant, coming from various kinds of stakeholder input. And if you zoom in, you can see the green bubbles are the ones in the health domain, but there's a lot of overlap with other areas. And if you play with this, you can click on something and see both the network, and you can expand to see the detail on the individual question as well. But the interesting thing here is actually we didn't tag things. The colors are the domains and which were put in the spreadsheet, but actually they're associated by various terms here, like toxicity and health, and then more detailed things, fish, resilience, various concepts. And they naturally self-organize into constellations that are closely related to the domains that are identified in say, the 4-box diagram in the flyer. So these are things that stakeholders are interested in, and in a sense, the question of building integrated models is a matter of figuring out what's the underlying causality or sort of dynamic structure of the problem that makes these things hang together, and how do you represent that in a model so that brings the nuances of, say, ocean physics and regional economies into the domain of health where that's appropriate. So when we think about building a model for the first time, we ask a set of questions. The key one is generally first, who's the decision maker, and who are their constituents, what other stakeholders are involved who may be influencing that decision maker or subject to their actions. We're also interested in what's the theory of change. You know, if you're engaged purely in figuring out what a molecule does, this may not be relevant, but as soon as you're into a domain that's affecting humans, at least downstream, this becomes important. So who's going to change their behavior or make a decision on the basis of the model, and how's the model going to influence that or bring the change about? And of course, implicit in that is some question of sort of what's your utility function, or what do you think you're trying to maximize? And then those questions start to guide the choice of scope. Which questions are you actually going to tackle in a particular project, over what time horizon, and what level of detail is needed to support that. And of course, there are lots of tensions in those choices. Then there's some questions of logistics, things like who's going to get the data, archive it, how will it be shared in the modeling community, who runs and maintains the model, and how do the results get out? Is it through interactive tools, or is it through reports, or interaction with stakeholders, or what? Certainly the climate integrated assessment space has lots of interesting precedents for this. So for example, you have a variety of processes like the RCPs and the CMIPs, where a class of models all get run against a common set of assumptions, and it generates a big database of projections, which can then be consumed by other modeling groups for different purposes. And then there's infrastructure both for comparing models and learning from them, and for disseminating the results online, so that it's easy to go and download the climate projections for your grid point if you want to do an assessment of the effects on vegetation or something. So in a sense, this is a question not so much of what are the models that we're going to make, but what are the processes that need to be put in place to help the modeling community to grow and interact with one another. There are also questions on many different time horizons and in many different levels of detail. So on the tactical side, you could imagine a situation where a spill occurs and you need to make real-time decisions about use of dispersants and closures and things like that. And then also maybe kind of near real-time assessment of damages and needs for funding or other allocation of resources. But then there's a second complementary time horizon, which is more of a set of design questions, like what are the rules for permitting new facilities based on the trade-offs between the, say, the benefits of oil platform production and employment versus the costs of spills and cleanups and closures and so on. Building community resilience is another example of kind of a long-term task that's tied up in a lot of things that don't particularly have much to do with oil, but have a lot to do with how coasts develop and other kinds of policies that may be very far removed from the direct impacts of spills. And of course, these different questions imply different kinds of models and different levels of detail required to answer them. And presumably you're also interacting with very different stakeholders, some of whom know a lot about oil spills and some not very much. So, you know, in general, this is a really hard problem, particularly over large spatial domains and long time horizons, because long duration means lots of active states in the system that separate cause from effect. Those complex dynamics basically confound intuition. That means that your stakeholders and decision makers probably have mental models of the way the system works that diverge somewhat from reality. And spatial diversity and economic diversity and other aspects mean that you have conflicting values among stakeholders, so you need to provide multiple views on the outcome, and also be careful about sort of how you tread on questions of value versus questions of fact or science or data. So the benefit of models is to provide a common analytical basis for discussion and separate the questions of facts that you can resolve somewhat materially, or where you can at least compare various theories with the aspects of reality that you think apply. Separate those from the questions that really involve negotiation about allocation of benefits or whose values are going to win in a decision-making process, which are really can be modeled at times, but generally better left to the political domain. Then, of course, integrated models add value to existing detailed data and models by placing them in the context of one another. And I think there's a big kind of network externality that increases the value of the information as you put more and more components together. And then for decision makers, what we're trying to do is let them perform what-if experiments that are cheap because they happen virtually, and maybe also more effective than operating in reality because they can account for uncertainty. And then finally, the process ought to be a learning process that identifies additional information that's needed to resolve key questions or uncertainties and directs resources towards the right kinds of questions. It's helpful then from a kind of a technical standpoint. There are a bunch of, to some extent, conflicting attributes that are useful. You'd like a model to be fast, so it's interactive and you can do lots of sensitivity analysis on it. You want it to be transparent so that the results can be traced back to fundamental assumptions, so that when you get into arguments about why something happened, you can understand sort of materially why it happened or causally why it happened, not sort of get superstitious learning out of the model the same way you get superstitious learning out of reality. You want it to be robust to extreme conditions, things that haven't been anticipated in the original construction of the model. You want it to communicate risk and uncertainty so that when answers are contingent or unknown, people appreciate that. Connected to social side effects, calibrated to data and history as at least one of the filters for establishing model quality. And then really the big tension is always, should it be simple to kind of favor transparency and breadth of coverage and kind of facilitate a simple understanding of the dynamics, or should it be complex so that it has lots of detail in order to both to provide fidelity and to link to the fact that stakeholders are operating in a complex situation where they may not be happy with a beach that aggregates the entire coast of Texas. They want to see their own city or county's segment of beach explicitly in the model, because that's how they operate. And of course, models that are going to serve decision makers as opposed to answering a scientific question are generally easier to link to a decision-making process if they're embedded in that process from the get-go, so that people are brought along with the model rather than sort of introduced to it as a finished product. But there are ways of doing that both ways. Uncertainty, I think, is kind of a key topic, just because risk communication in all domains is difficult, and there's kind of a prevailing mindset out there for use of models that's kind of unfortunate, which is the mindset of using the model to predict what's going to happen and then come up with a set of decisions that responds to that scenario. And of course, there are a lot of problems with that. One is that it's unlikely that you can actually make those predictions in most cases. So you wind up creating decisions around best guess scenarios that will never come true. So we'd like to shift the mindset to the extent that we can to kind of a hedging strategy that embraces uncertainty, where a few things are inevitable or predictable or controllable, but we have to make decisions that account for the residual uncertainty, which may be the dominant part of any particular decision. So we're looking not just for predictive decisions, but for robust decisions. When you start integrating things, there are a number of sort of loose categories of approaches. So the one that in a sense you always start with is having a portfolio of independent models, so the left box here, each of which answers a particular question or tackles some subset of the problem. Essentially, this is what you always start with when you enter a new domain where there's lots of existing research to be integrated. And a lot can be done without building integrated models, just by building kind of a better portal into that information, so that somebody who wants to understand how a question gets answered, they can at least find the model or the researcher or the researcher who knows about the subset of the problem that they're interested in particular. Another possibility, and I think we've already seen a couple examples of this on Monday, is federation of models. So you have a detailed model of, say, ocean physics and a detailed model of some aspect of health or ecosystems, and you link those together through either some kind of programming interface or some kind of data flow chain, so that you simulate the physics model and then use that output as input to the health model, for example. And that makes really good use of existing resources, because you sort of take the assets that you have and then exploit them in new ways without doing a lot of additional construction. The logical extension of that is kind of the Metamodel approach, where you do something like you take the physics model, which has a three-dimensional grid, and you augment its state vector, which initially contains things like salinity and the amount of various chemicals within each grid point, and you add additional things like the number of fish or people or whatever at each grid cell, and you simulate the whole thing as one giant integrated whole. So that gives you the tightest possible sort of integration and consistency of the physics with the ecosystems, with the risks and other things. But at the same time, it's potentially extremely expensive, either computationally or in terms of the money, people, time, and other resources needed to create and maintain the model. It becomes extremely data hungry, for example. So the opposite side, essentially, of the mega model is a metamodel approach, where you create a single top-down model that essentially contains components that are individually meta models of the detailed things. So it has response surfaces or just simple quadratic functions or whatever that are a simple representation of each of the detailed components that would be in a federation or a mega model approach. And you use that to tie things together. And I'll show you an example of what I mean by that last space, just because it's illustrative of how the processes have worked in other domains. So this is a model, and actually let me shift to the actual modeling tool. Sorry, I have quite a few windows here. This is a model that happened in California in transport fuels. So they had legislation in 2007 or 8 mandating that the state do an assessment of the transport fuel policy space, essentially future scenarios for greenhouse gas mitigation. So they had this spaghetti diagram here, captures the kind of the key causality in the space. It's things like the vehicle fleet, vehicle miles traveled, fuel use, and then the supply side in the yellow blob of fuel supply, inventories, refinery capacity, and these are tied together by some other things, people's expectations of fuel prices that influence their choices of new vehicle efficiency and so on. So it's a mix of kind of the physics of the petroleum supply network and the physics of the vehicle fleet with the sort of behavioral economics of decision making in these areas. And they had existing models that covered both domains. They had one called CalCars. It was a very detailed vehicle fleet model. Had sort of every model year in 7 different classes of vehicles, each with its own efficiency level. And they had a very detailed petroleum network model that had every refinery and import terminal and distribution point in it so that it could generate spatially explicit fuel prices subject to various constraints about special blends of fuels and things like that. But the car model didn't know anything about petroleum prices, and the petroleum supply model didn't know anything about driving or fuel demand. And the only thing that glued them together was an economic model, a general equilibrium model called EDRAM. But there's a problem in the federation there, which is that the car model is denominated in cars and barrels of oil or gallons of gasoline consumed, and the petroleum supply model is in barrels of capacity of various sorts. And the economic model doesn't have any explicit cars, and it doesn't have any explicit network other than a sector that is generating refinery capacity, and it's denominated in dollars. So it's hard to glue these things together. Nevertheless, they did it, and I think they did a good job, essentially by creating a data flow between the three and manually iterating them into an equilibrium, and they got projections out of that. So the problem was that the manual iteration of these things and through kind of a data flow model of passing files around was extremely slow. So they were only able to do a couple of scenarios, and then they generated a report. And of course, when that got out to the public, it got beat up from all sides. So the refiners had one set of complaints about it, and the environmental NGOs had another set of complaints about it. And there was no way for the process to respond to the sort of both the factual challenges and the valuation concerns of the various stakeholders or constituencies for the model. So we came along, and there was kind of a rare moment of confluence of interests by the refiners and the regulators and the NGOs, all of whom wanted to avoid a train wreck in implementation of various greenhouse gas policies. So we led a series of collaborative discussion processes designed at facilitating the development of greenhouse gas regulations. So we had the refiners and the electric utilities and the environmental NGOs and the State Air Resources Board and Energy Commission all sitting at the same table to talk about these things. So to facilitate that, we built a really simple integrated model of this same domain. And you can't digest this on the fly, but this is the entire model. So this was a Metamodel approach. So we distilled the vehicle fleet into a single stock of cars. So you have a fleet, and people are discarding vehicles over time, and then they're purchasing new ones to replace what they discard and to adjust the fleet towards what they want based on fuel prices and income and other considerations that come from another piece of the model. And then every time you add a car to the fleet, you add its fuel requirements to the aggregate stock of fuel that you would need to run the whole vehicle fleet at kind of normal utilization. So from that, you can work out the average fuel efficiency of the whole vehicle fleet. And then the same thing exists on the supply side. There's capacity to import and import or refine fuels, and that's constrained by limitations from permitting. And then there's a fuel inventory. So you produce fuel, stock it, and then people consume it based on how much they drive, how many cars they have, and so on. And then these two pieces of the system are connected by prices, essentially, as the market clearing mechanism, though there's some other things that affect driver behavior, like road congestion. So then you can run the model and test policies that are on the table. So at the time, California mandated a 45% increase in fuel efficiency. So this is new vehicle fuel efficiency over on the right, goes up overnight by 45%. In reality, it has to be phased in. But already there were non-intuitive aspects of this for decision makers. There are things that are kind of obvious to energy analysts, but not to everybody else. So average fuel economy takes much longer to go up because the vehicle fleet in California lasts 18 or 19 years. So there's very slow turnover. And then you have side effects from that. So because vehicles are more efficient, it's cheaper to drive, people drive more. There's a slight rebound effect, which you can see here in vehicle miles traveled on the left. And then you can see immediately, if you look at the revenue side of the picture, that industry revenue is going to be down dramatically. So you're going to have a huge political fight over this. And from the state's perspective, there's a big problem because people are driving more, but road tax or fuel tax revenue is down. So you have more cars on the road and less money to spend on road infrastructure, and therefore you're going to have sort of service quality problems. So then you could start to think about how could you offset that by, say, increasing the gas tax. So I've slightly increased the fuel tax here in order to make that efficiency policy revenue neutral. So that's great for the state, or maybe actually we should go up a little since people are going to be driving more. But it's still, that makes things even worse from the industry's perspective. So there's going to be, even if it's the right thing to do, a political challenge to getting that done. So this model is extremely simple. The simplicity facilitates running in real time or kind of instantaneous time, essentially, so that you can rapidly get insights out of it. And then it also supports some other things. You can do comparisons between the model and data and look at whether the, you can use that to essentially rule out some theories. So if you think the vehicle fleet turns over faster than the model is saying, you can look at that and you can see here that that's not consistent with the data unless you make some other assumptions to somehow bring that in back into compliance. So it's, the model's also operating as a filter for kind of bringing information into the discussion. And you can run it thousands or tens of thousands of times if you want in order to look at, oh, and I don't have this loaded, but you can look at the answers not just as single simulation outcomes, but you can look at it as confidence bounds so that you can make essentially contingent decisions about not just what minimizes greenhouse gases in one scenario, but what maximizes your expectation of improving the situation with respect to greenhouse gases or some other criteria you're interested in. So that's typically where we come from, but often these models need to have more detail in them because people are interested in the distinction between cars and trucks, or they're interested in geography or some other aspect of detail in the system that's needed for fidelity in the representation or for the connection to the kind of the level of detail at which the decision makers are actually operating. So this is where we come from, and what I'd like to do with the rest of our time is think about prospects for doing more integrated modeling in your space. Before I shift back, any questions or thoughts or comments? Okay. So here's the, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, this is Claire Paris. I've been working with Image on this kind of model integration, and I think I really like to see that this is the type of modeling that we're doing. We're doing Metamodel, where we have basically sub-modules that you can turn on and off, but everything operates within a single model. So this is really the kind of work we've been already doing. But obviously this needs a lot more expansion towards human health and other models that could be also include that submodule. So just to mention that. And also you talked about calibrating the model with data. And I'd like to know what you mean by that, because sometimes when you do calibrate the model with data, then you need always to bring in some data rather than modeling the processes and use initial conditions from the data.
Oh, right. Well, let's see. In the model that I showed you, what that meant was estimating a few behavioral parameters like how sensitive to price and income are people when they choose vehicle fuel efficiency or choose whether to buy a vehicle or use some other mode, you know, living closer to work or taking the train or something like that. So there are a few behavioral parameters in that model. They're basically price and income elasticities that we calibrated. But then we also, you know, of course, there's a huge literature on price elasticity of energy consumption behavior. So you also have you have data, and you can use the structure of the model and the data to make one estimate, but you can subject that to priors that you get from lots of other literature. The challenge is in that case that a lot of the other literature is actually kind of crazy. You know, so if you, well, I won't go into the depths of the economics there, but you you have to apply a filter. So then I guess the third filter then that we apply, that I'm sure you use in your own work as well, especially since you're coming from kind of the physics domain where habits are better, I think, than they are in economics, is to simply ensure that the model's respecting conservation laws and dimensional consistency and behaves robustly in extreme conditions and things like that. So we endeavor to bring all those things into it. So this is the problem space. Oh, you're welcome. And I guess what struck me as I started thinking about this was that essentially the human health box is in itself an unbelievably complicated space, because there are lots of aspects to health. And on Monday we talked about things like cancer risk and so on, but there are lots of other things that are of interest, both other kinds of risks and interaction with human activities. And then there's the whole side of what's the healthcare delivery system doing to respond to that, and how does that interact with the socioeconomic aspects of what you can afford to do, and how people's job prospects and control over their own destiny affects their mental state, and so on. So this is a super complicated piece of the system. And then of course there are lots of possible interventions as well that have an impact. So I'm curious to kind of quickly inventory what the questions are for what stakeholders. And of course the Sea Grant material already contains a lot of questions that have been collected over the years. The thing I don't have as much visibility from the questions is on why stakeholders are asking these particular questions and not other ones, because these are generally questions about kind of how does the system work, and they may imply things about decision making in the future. So if people are asking what are the dispersant effects on human and animal health, then presumably underlying that, partly there's simple curiosity about that and wanting to know what happened to them, but there's also a question of next time around, should we use dispersants or not, or should we take other measures to protect people from effects of dispersants and things like that. So each of these questions about how things work implies kind of a corresponding question or decision about how you might intervene in the system to make things better. So I'm just curious what the mapping is. What are the key decisions in this space?
May I interject here? This is Emily Mong Douglas from Sea Grant.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I'd like to point out that with those questions, as you said, there are sort of corresponding or related questions, as you mentioned, and I absolutely agree with you that there's a lot that can be inferred from them. I don't know how it fits into modeling, but just to give you all some context, I think a lot of these questions just stem from the fact that during Deepwater Horizon, there were a lot of gaps in scientific knowledge, and that didn't just stop at the scientific community, right? That also extended to these stakeholder groups. And so I think that when considering these questions and how they fit into the model, it might be useful to keep that in mind, that just the lack of the scientific knowledge and people realizing that, I think that really plays into the mental health aspect. And I think that has been shown in the literature, just in the sense that stress was a big problem, and that, as I guess you're kind of getting to, plays into profession as well, because some of those things are related to profession, and that uncertainty of what would happen to the seafood, for example, it doesn't just play into the physical health aspect, but also plays into the mental health aspect as well. So just a little bit of context.
I'm just going to make myself a note here about that. That's a great point. So in a sense, actually, creation of the models themselves is potentially a useful act, in that it, to some extent, you can answer stakeholder questions and lower their stress, and maybe focus it on things that really they ought to be stressed about. Other comments?
Hi, this is Alicia. In going through your presentation in terms of putting all these models together, it's kind of going to be something that's kind of after the fact. You almost wish that 10 years ago we sort of decided what was going to be the format, what were going to be the populations, what were going to be all these questions, and we sort of developed these models all together. So it is going to be difficult now to put them together, this year, next year, the next couple of years. So, maybe that comment is not useful because this is where we're at. But it's a pity that we didn't have sort of this coming together 10 years ago.
Right. I can see that, although I guess we run into this in every domain that we come to afresh. So, and of course, if you look at climate integrated assessment, where they were at this stage a long time ago, there's still a huge amount of learning and integration going on, and so there may be a little farther down the road, but there's still an awful lot to the journey. So, maybe I could ask on the what do you consider the key question on beaches, for example, and who are the consumers of that?
Is that question for me, Alicia?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're sort of, what we're doing right now is getting the activity patterns and getting it right for this population. So this is really a focused look on one population, but I do believe that we have to do it across all populations that might be of interest to get, part of that exposure risk is that contact, that exposure. So we're sort of trying to get that right. But, and we're also doing the model in the fate and transport, and Claire's presentation was great. She's got some great models for that. But one person had a really fascinating question, which is true. we build this model where we're doing the fate and transport from the spill event, but there are activities going on that will change that event, and how do we integrate that into the spill model? Not just the oceanic sort of, what's going on in the ocean and all that stuff, but if you use the dispersants, if you do some cleanup activities, if you change things, how does your model become dynamic? And so we're going to have to think about how even the activity patterns. So we're looking at an activity pattern when nothing is going on, right? We're videotaping these children on the beaches. We're answering the surveys at any one point. And you talked about this earlier. Things change. Things are dynamically changing. And we're building this platform not knowing what else or how to integrate these changes or these mitigating factors that might occur. And so that will be a challenge. Can we think of all possible mitigation factors and then build them into the model now? And over the next year, we'll work more on that. So if we can learn from everyone for just this, what we're doing, that will help.
So part of that is how individuals perceive the situation and alter their own behavior, but then presumably also some of that passes through state or local control, in the sense that, if a beach gets closed, then a certain component of exposure is reduced or eliminated. So do you see your model interacting with particular groups of decision makers who might kind of look at the results or the insights out of that and do things differently?
In all honesty, we didn't really plan for that or talk about that enough in the proposal, but I do think that we're learning, and I do think that we're going to have to sit down as a group and talk more about how can we integrate those factors. Does it impact the fate transport model part? Does it impact our activity pattern, or when we put it all together in the risk? So I just think we have to talk about doing that in our last year now, building better models.
Okay.
Thomas, can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah, sure.
So just in terms of what you're trying to get out of this, I think and this is a statement, but it's really a question. The list of Sea Grant questions versus what you're asking here, it seems like what you're asking here is how is the model going to be used? What are our goals for what people are going to use this model for? Versus the Sea Grant questions, I think you're worried because those are more, what are the data gaps available for building the model?
Yeah, so I'm particularly interested in the question of how's this going to get used, and I guess actually my sort of framework here implies that it's used directly in decision making, so there probably ought to be another column about what are kind of the what are the big uncertainties or the big unknowns from a scientific standpoint, or kind of a scientific and socioeconomic standpoint. So one being, how do activity patterns change dynamically in response to perceptions and policies and so forth? So that may be the thing to figure out, I guess. So then in that case, the question in the model is sort of, what's the risk from a spill? And there may be other questions that the decision maker would ask, like, should I close a beach, or should I close a fishery, or what protective gear should I give to cleanup personnel? All sorts of things like that. So I'm interested in getting at those questions.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, this is Erin with USF. So talking about these models and data gaps, the one thing that I would recommend or like to see is more of a cumulative risk assessment in terms of human health. And and it seems like all of these models are based on acute exposures of a major oil spill. But I'd like to remind everybody that the Gulf is chronically exposed and has been since the 30s. And in fact, since 2012, there's been at least 12 spills since then. So I think we really need to think about the chronic exposure and adding that into these models.
I started wondering about that yesterday. I was looking at a map of offshore rigs and other facilities from the USGS, and there were 8,000 of them. So it seemed inconceivable to me that spills were not more or less a continuous process at some scale.
It is, and I know that the current risk assessments for seafood safety indicate that there's very low, if any, risk. But I think we need to continue that monitoring, because what we are seeing in both exposure through biliary PAHs and liver PAHs, we're seeing both increased exposures and increased liver accumulation. So at some point, that's going to turn into increased muscle concentration once their metabolic capability is less than the accumulation rate.
Great. How about questions in other spaces? So for example, the models that we saw on Monday were looking at essentially taking the oil fate or transport and plugging that into human health exposure, translating that to risk. Well, actually, that's 2 out of 3. What about healthcare system modeling, or things that are kind of closer to the socio-economic component? Is there anything in the consortium or near the consortium that's looking at, you know, say what's the capacity of coastal communities to respond to added health loads or things like that?
This is Bert Singer. Melissa Finnecane actually has a consortium that's dealing with that sort of question. In addition, there's a substantial group at Tulane that works in that area. And so I think there will be a fair bit of information out there on that topic.
Hey, this is Lori Baker. One of the things that we do in our branch is we work with the poison control centers, and we have algorithms running so that we can detect when uptakes and calls to the poison centers happen. So that's something else that would be available. Basically, the National Poison Data System, NPDS.
Oh, interesting. So this is a sort of a monitoring activity?
Kind of, yes. Yes. So the idea is that we can detect increases in calls to the poison centers and then possibly head off outbreaks. So I'm sure people started calling the poison centers.
Interesting. So the kind of decision here is
what happens is when we detect an uptick in calls, we notify the state health department, and then they take it from there.
Ah, okay. So the kind of the actor is cool.
Would be the health department, yeah.
Yeah. Are there other spaces?
It seems like, just before we move off that, the real question there is which populations are being exposed and to what, right? That's really the decision-making question for that. And the data gap would be, you know, poison control reporting.
And let's see, it's the sort of the CDC is the first actor, and then that gets passed on to the state as kind of the intervener.
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Let's see. I know there must be other actors involved when you get into the mental health domain as well. I don't know if was David Abramson on the call. I'm not sure he's joined us.
Do we have information, or I don't know if this plays into this at all, but something that I've encountered with stakeholders, discussions we've had before, and also within the group, the Sea Grant group, is domestic violence reports. It seems like that would play into stress, and that might be something you could easily track, if not now, in the future.
So, so it's kind of the same idea of who's exposed to what, only the exposure is things like, and I've put this in the wrong box. Well, I'll leave it here because it's a potential data stream. All right. Well, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, this is Claire. I think that David Abram was talking about BP claims, and I think that was a good idea to look at those to assess.
Oh, yeah.
You know what? Yeah.
As a indicator of kind of economic stress, and I think he was talking about rejected claims in particular. Okay, interesting.
Yes, correct.
Another question that decision makers might ask, and this is getting back to that restoration question I asked, is, you know, how do restoration projects that are built to address natural resource damages impact some of these human health and socioeconomic stressors? So if a restoration project is designed to prop back up a fishery, would that have positive benefits, not just on the fishery, but on, you know, fishermen that are stressed out because of their loss of earnings potential? A similar question with timing. You know, it's taking quite a while to get restoration projects stood up in the Gulf. It would be really interesting if the model could tell you, boy, if you had been able to do that project 5 years ago, you would have gained X, Y, and Z additional benefits.
Great questions. And I could imagine there's a whole constellation of things there also related to the chronic exposure question.
Absolutely.
If you're remediating things that are a source of ongoing exposure, for example.
Right. Well, and remember the restoration projects aren't just, you know, dealing with the contaminant itself, right? It could be you're just building more marsh to offset.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a whole suite of things you could look at there, right?
Great. Okay. Well, we should keep moving here since there's, well, sort of an infinite amount of ground to cover. So I'm curious to drill a little more into kind of what's in the human health box specifically. So kind of the key things that we're trying to measure within that box. So there's sort of the internal state of the target populations with respect to, well, so actually one thing that's in the box essentially is detail about who are the target populations, who specifically is at risk, and how do demographic attributes influence that. But then what are other things that we're interested in? So it's the cancer risk came up. Mental health status is another.
All non-cancer outcomes are important too.
Okay. what else is in there? Oh, and then we talked a couple minutes ago about the healthcare delivery system.
Current health status. I don't know if that's in your target population detail.
Oh, yeah, okay. So maybe that does belong there.
The dose response relationship among all of these things.
Which is sort of the mapping from exposure to various things to the outcomes. One thing I was curious about in the dose response relationships is there's a hazard ratio or a odds ratio or something, and you can characterize a dose response curve, but presumably there are also some dynamics to that. So you're exposed to oil today, you get cancer 5 years later or 20 years later. Do the models include kind of the internal states or disaggregation of people into exposed and triggered and then actively sick from one thing or another?
Not our current model. This is complex. Even these dose response curves, all the chemicals are not well studied. There are many things that cause cancer, including just stress itself. So to do the whole dose response, what we're doing, we're simply, using an odds ratio from this, even the exposure part is very difficult. This is challenging. Just the health risk endpoint is challenging because there's so much going on that could cause some of these outcomes.
Right. Oh, and then that essentially risky behavior, or the risk profile of behaviors that might not be considered risky, is something else that came up in our previous discussion. How about inputs? So, and these are not, I'm just using this as essentially 3 lists. So one input is sort of the exposure to various things from the physical models. Are there other key inputs?
There's a data set on dosimeter badges formed by Deepwater Horizon workers. Richard Kwok and Dale Sandler's team at NIEHS have that. So that would be some real exposures, not just physical models.
Yep. And then I know in some of the things we heard about on Monday, there were kind of county level socioeconomic indicators of various sorts.
Right.
So then key outputs that decision makers are interested in, or do you have another input?
Yes, the other input, is all the data from study of toxicity on the marine environment organisms and plankton that could be used as proxy, as as a proxy of exposure.
Right.
Toxicity data like the LC50 or LC20, meaning the level of toxicity that make like 20% of the population die, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of data on that that can be used as proxy.
And not just lethal concentrations.
Or exposure.
Sublethal endpoints.
Right. Right. As proxy of, the levels that would be affecting the human health.
Okay.
I also think we need to think about multiple chemical exposure, meaning someone talked about cumulative, meaning over time, but you also have cumulative to mean exposure to more than one chemical. Maybe it's low and it doesn't hit a dose response, but what happens when we're exposed to 100 chemicals that have the same toxicity endpoint? How do we deal with that in the model?
Yeah, I'm following up on that. You could use the relative potency approach for the multiple exposures, multiple chemical exposures.
And even beyond chemistry, right? One of the things that the marine mammal community is worried about for a long time are the cumulative effects of noise and chemistry and, climate change. So they've developed models called the PCOMS model, PCOMS, and PCOD, PCOD. So we could look at those as, templates for building something with human health.
Okay, great. How about outputs particularly in terms of what a decision maker might be interested in seeing? So obviously some of these things translate directly.
We want to know potential risk. We want to know what are the greatest hazards, how to break the chain, so to speak. Where can we have impact in the model to prevent this risk?
Oh, that's a good one.
I have to say the models have to be probabilistic, like it's not only like from a simulation of the Deepwater Horizon spill or anything like that. It would be like simulating a bunch of different scenarios and having like some probabilistic models that would give you this kind of risk assessment.
And I guess that's particularly true where you're talking about cumulative exposure and where you can't track a particular spill because you have a whole bunch of spills. So you're interested in kind of uncertain cumulative deposition in various points in the system, involved with all the other uncertainties about the toxicity and things like that. Okay.
Like Claire talked about on Monday, just socioeconomic kind of population level inferences, right? Which counties will be at risk and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Right. The social vulnerability index, for example, which is something that are one of the major output of the socio-economical models.
And do states or other actors look at those things and actively use that as a way to, allocate relief funding or other kinds of resources? Or is that connection kind of tenuous?
I think if there were data available, they might, but I don't know how much data is actually available.
So if you could come up with something that was compelling, there are decision makers out there who would listen.
One of the things you might want to add to internal states is preparedness. One of the things we're doing right now is looking at whether or not having these preparedness kits changes the outcome when people are exposed to a disaster. I'm not sure where that goes. I guess that's internal states, yeah.
Yeah, I think I'll probably move this to the question list, but that's a good one. All right, well, yeah, go ahead.
One more? One more output should be, just based on what everybody's saying too, should be our uncertainty. Where do we need more data? Where do we need more studies? So, to tell us a little bit about what we're lacking.
Yep. Great. Okay. I'd love to keep going on this because it's interesting and productive, but I'd like to shift over to drawing or kind of eliciting some of the relationships among the boxes. Okay, so I'm just gonna, so here's the, actually there's one more list task here, which is, are there any models that have names attached to them that are kind of already running now, either integrated or within a particular domain? I know on Monday, Claire and Alicia mentioned a couple. So are there others we should add to that list? Models or citations or things that are kind of beginning to be integrated?
Well, the connectivity modeling system is one that is open source and that has a bunch of like different submodules where the oil itself is a submodule, but it does work with different components. For example, UV exposure, cumulative exposure, and things like that are part of the model. And it integrates the ocean circulation model, coastal exposure, a lot of like different, it's definitely a modular standalone. So each module is standalone and also is open source, except for the oil that is not open source because we're still under development, but other part of the model are all on GitHub.
Oh, cool. And I think in your presentation, you also mentioned fisheries. Is there an ecosystem component in CMS, or is that a separate model component?
Right, so for the fisheries, it's something that we're building as a submodule as well. So it's not open, it's not online yet because we're building it right now with the NAS, but yes, it will be part of the CMS as well.
Okay, great. Any other sort of models that are at an advanced enough state to have an acronym or a name or a URL that are resources here? If you, incidentally, if you think of anything after the call, you can always email me and I'll integrate it into the material. I want to talk a little bit now about connections. So essentially how the human health box relates to the others. So I've made kind of a simplified version of this that we can just annotate on the fly. So we've already talked about a bunch of things here. So one is there's sort of fate or transport from physics is an input from the physics box to the human health box. So I've actually indicated with arrows sort of all possible causal connections here. I don't know if there actually is a connection from the human health box back to the physics box. Does that ring a bell with anybody? And I guess I should augment this link of fate and transport because really what you're trying to get, as I understand it, is exposure.
Well, you're trying to get the chemical concentrations from the fate and transport.
Mm-hmm. So exposure is kind of a combination of the fate and transport plus activities and behavior. Is that right?
Yes.
So then that impacts that box. So that's kind of the the idea. Is there a link from human health back to any aspect of the physics, or is that kind of unimportant?
There's human activity that may impact the physics to some degree. Or
Yeah. So that's sort of choices like use of dispersants.
Yeah, cleanup activities.
Yeah, certainly this, but this is also integrated into the freight and transport model, the use of dispersants, because it just changes the chemistry and the physics.
Yeah, so this is in the CMS, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. How about the ecosystem interaction? I mean, I can imagine strong links from the socio-economic box to ecosystems and strong links from ecosystems to human health. I'm not sure about this other link from human health back to ecosystems. Or what are the ecosystem to human health links? So one is fish consumption or fish harvest.
Water quality.
Oh yeah.
Air concentration.
So it seems like there should be an arrow from ecosystems to freight transport to human health.
Oh, yeah. So meaning,
like if you're talking about following chemicals, then it's not really ecosystems directly to human health if you have freight and transport already. But then there's also, if there's less fish around and the fish are of poorer quality, then that's going to affect human health directly, right?
So sort of fish has an aspect of quantity. I could spell it, as well as quality. So quality being toxicity and other related aspects, and quantity being simply do people have fish in their diet, and if not, what other protein are they getting, or where do they get there?
I would say with quantity, it's not just about the nutritional aspect, but also remember that so many people in the Gulf, their livelihoods depend on the fisheries in some aspects. So it comes back to the socioeconomic, but also the human health, because the stress, that was a huge stressor.
Yeah. So so actually that link is
Yeah, I would do the quantity would be biomass. That's what the ecosystem model is generating, some value of like the change of the biomass of different, the ecosystem or different populations. Population level meaning same species.
And in CMS, are you also tracking bioaccumulation so that the oil enters the fish through this top link? It gets into the ecosystem, enters the fish, and so on, and then that affects the quality of fish and or seafood more generally that people are consuming.
Right. At the moment, is just a transfer of the variable of the chemistry into the ecosystem model, and also we have the CMS also produces the larval side of the fishery. So we have all the larval exposure as well. So this is like a complex model because the CMS is not only oil, like I say, it could be fish larvae, could be anything, could be plastic and pollutants and other things. And this is affecting the ecosystem. But right now we don't have like a sub-module called ecosystem. We're working with the Atlantis model, but it could be any kind of ecosystem model, to look at what you say, the federal model before. This with ecosystem modeling is not yet a mega model, like it is for most of the other components, but we're moving into that direction as well. But right now, if you wouldn't have like this option at the moment to have the tracking the pollutant through the CMS into the fish. You would have to go through the Atlantis model that will tell you changes in biomass based on the output of the CMS.
Okay.
And other things.
And is Atlantis just fish, or is it a full ecosystem itself?
It's a full ecosystem.
Yeah.
Hi,
I think they will talk about it next week.
Oh, that'll be in next week's. Yeah, question.
Yes, I do think you need to have a separate box for human behavior. Human behavior, your fish harvesting, your fish consumption, human behavior actually can affect any of these boxes here. Just, there could be a different way to design it.
To kind of draw this diagram, yeah, and actually I think the original box does have a sort of a decision box in the middle.
What we do can impact all of these things.
Right. I will endeavor to come up with a way to add that to all these things, but I think I won't draw it at the moment.
Okay.
How about health to socio-economic system links? I can imagine things like mental health status affecting productivity and employment and things like that.
Physical health as well, right?
Yeah.
I would also say it's a two-way street, because in many ways, if people aren't working, then that also impacts their mental health. So it's a
so that's essentially this loop, that physical and mental health affects employment and other things, and then that leads to, or lack of employment, for example, causes stress.
I would also have recreational opportunities there.
And so that's a socioeconomic to health effect, because it influences stress and exercise and things like that?
Yeah.
But then presumably it also works the other way from decision making. If people perceive that there's a health risk and close the beach, then nobody gets to swim, for example.
Yep. Yeah, that's right. It goes both ways.
Yeah, that really plays into what Alicia was saying before with the behavior.
Right. Okay. What else is connected here? I'm curious about water quality, actually. We kind of, and air as well. Is air kind of a physics thing, in the sense that you're talking about chemical constituents that are blowing off the tops of waves and so on, or is it also mediated by ecosystems?
And I suppose you have microbial communities that could be affecting your exposures. And I guess what I'm having trouble with is, it seems like you're going to need to develop different modules for what I think you're thinking of as sort of physical environmental exposures and food web exposures, right? I think that's what you're trying to wrestle with right now. And maybe that's the difference between the arrow going through fate and transport from physics to human health versus physics to ecosystems to human health.
Right. I think that's exactly right. So there's an exposure pathway, which is oil gets into the ecosystem and then accumulates and ultimately gets consumed to some extent by humans. And then there's also direct exposure from being exposed to air or the slick on the beach or things like that. And presumably also the ecosystems are also sort of, this link means that they're tangled up in the fate and transport processes of, or in particular the degradation processes.
Absolutely,
in
yes.
Quite a few different ways, I guess.
Yeah,
so
because
actually,
you have biodegradation depends on, biodegradation, for example, of the oil.
Depends on
the ecosystem itself, and physics is also moving the plankton in the ecosystem. So different levels of interactions here between physics, ecosystem, back and forth.
Okay, so actually then water quality is also kind of tangled up both between the physics and the ecosystem piece. How about things like tourism? Clearly that's an aspect of employment. Are there?
I think from what we found that definitely plays into what's kind of already on there about the stress and the physical, not the physical necessarily, but the mental health in terms of that behavior change. People aren't coming to visit, location X on the coast. So then that depresses the economy or the local businesses. And then that has an impact on that community's mental health.
And is there any understanding of sort of what it is that makes tourists tick? So for example, do they avoid coastal areas just because they perceive that there's a risk, which may or may not actually be there?
That's my understanding of the situation from just from things that we've seen talking with stakeholders. It seems like the ratio of misinformation to accurate information is it's tricky.
Do people actually measure that?
I don't know. That's a great question.
Be really interesting.
But it's definitely just from talking with people. Even people within the community, there's a lot of misinformation.
I could imagine. All right. Well, I'd like to talk about a few more, maybe shorter topics. So I'm sure we could go on at this. Yeah, go ahead.
Just as a question, preparedness was brought up early in terms of a sense of resilience. How do you bring the state of preparedness into this in terms of the quality of services that are available to support human health and socioeconomic preparedness? I think is a major underlying question, and there's probably a number of dimensions of that that are probably not well measured at all.
That was certainly in the Sea Grant question list over and over, in particular the resilience question of how do you make a community resilient, and presumably to some extent that implies resilience to health threats. And
okay, good.
Yeah. Anybody want to comment on that?
Seems like that'll go in your, wherever you end up putting your human behavior box, right?
Yeah, and actually, we'll have another working session on the kind of the orange box items a little way in a couple weeks, so we'll get a chance to talk about that more. Okay, let's see, next on the menu here. So we talked about connections, and actually we've already talked quite a bit about this, so we might just spend a minute or two on it. I'm just curious what you perceive as missing in terms of missing models, missing data, missing connections among existing models, and missing connections to decision-making processes. What is it that ought to be built in order to get more integrated?
I was looking at the chat box, and Larissa Montes had a really awesome point that if chronic exposure is to be looked at as well, and really anything that we're talking about, does the current environmental sampling and monitoring system provide enough data to use as input? And I know, especially for marine mammals, and you can probably just go right down the list, the question is always, can we build a monitoring system or a sampling program that will be robust enough to actually seed all of these models, right? Mm-hmm. And that's something that decision makers are always fighting for in terms of, you know, how much money is a monitoring system going to cost versus the benefits it provides to a model.
Sure. And then, of course, that becomes intrinsically contentious, because one way to suppress information that you don't want is to prevent its collection in the first place. Other aspects?
I think one of the aspects we talked about is the uncertainty. So we have to have some probabilistic modeling in a way, not only for the physics but for other things, so that we can answer those questions with more accuracy. And you mentioned that earlier, that it is important to provide a sense of risk based on the uncertainty.
Is there anything that you see as especially important on that front? You know, a particular parameters or measurements that are uncertain that people, decision makers in particular, need to appreciate?
Well, I would say, for example, for the fishery closure, that during the Deepwater Horizon spill was based on seafood contamination, but we can, you know, give like maybe other estimates looking at the toxicity level of the water and things like that. So there's some improvement in terms of the proxy we use to assess the risk of food contamination, for example. Mm-hmm. And you know, a lot of question has to do with that. You know, does the Corexit affect the food and the fish and we eat? And we don't really have an answer for that. All we can have is proxies that can, you know, make people feel more comfortable with the answer we give based on the model. So we have to be very careful with this kind of assessment, because we don't really have an precise answers.
Right, and so actually, in some of those things, if there are really no measurements and not much prior history to go on, then they're in the box of unknown unknowns potentially, where it's hard to put a parameter in the model that captures the distribution of possibilities, because you don't even know what that looks like.
Yeah, and then I think in terms of the modeling of the risk of contamination based on different oil spill model, I think we need to make more of the probabilistic simulation and have, for example, a map in the Gulf of Mexico of what is the probability of some area being more contaminated than others based on what you saw the USG map of where the block that will be exploited are. And not only the current one, but the future one.
Oh, so for example, you'd take a lease block and say, okay, if you have X amount of activity in here, what's the kind of probabilistic, what's the distribution of possible cumulative loads on each segment of the coast, or
right,
something like that?
Yeah, on the coast, on the,
yeah.
the seafloor, how it's affecting different part of the ecosystem. That could be done with probabilistic scenarios, the same that I show about, forecasting system.
Yep.
Where you can say, okay, well, the risk are like, 80% of this area is has more risk, or this level of pH in this area is would be assessed in this way. So I guess, yes, probabilistic modeling is something that is still needed.
And that relates to the chronic exposure question as well, then.
Right.
And are these models fast enough that you can run them thousands of times to generate those things, or is that a kind of a huge computational burden where you might need some extra resources to do it?
Well, that's a good question. The model can be run very fast, but the post-processing needs a lot of computational power. We'll have now at the University of Miami, we have like a new, I think it's called Triton, is a new supercomputer. So that requires resources, but it's possible. The good news is that it's possible. It does require resources, like blocking certain number of, part of the supercomputer to do this kind of analysis.
Plus somebody has to look at the stuff at least the first time around to make sure things are working and so on, and it's non-trivial to set it all up, I'm sure.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, you don't just like press a button and it just runs. No, you have to monitor. No,
yeah.
Yes, it takes some people power as well. But it's possible. The good news is it's possible.
Okay, cool. Last thing I want to ask about is if there are any processes, organizational infrastructure or conferences or other things that would be helpful for facilitating future integration, for kind of going further with what we now have.
And I'm sure you guys are thinking about it, but GridC obviously is a huge repository of all of the GoMRI data that could be integrated. And they have some infrastructure, new infrastructure capacities that they've developed with Texas A&M lately. So.
Okay, so that's an existing process. Are there any processes that kind of explicitly seek out and integrate decision makers? That would be an interesting thing to consider. I mean, I guess thinking about climate as an analogy, there are lots of processes that bring decision makers together, and then all of the modelers show up for these things, like the COP meetings. But the integration there is a little bit ad hoc, partly because every country has its own version of the EPA and its own pathways. But certainly there's kind of an active ecosystem there.
I guess the closest thing I can think of might be the region-wide TIG that's kind of running the show for the restoration on Deepwater.
TIG is TIG.
Yeah, it's the Trustee Implementation Group. So they're tasked with, organizing and managing all the different restoration projects out of Deepwater Horizon.
Okay.
And so they will have many representatives from each state, from each federal agency. They'll be the ones that are thinking about the monitoring of all those projects, and building, databases or whatever they need to house all that data. I think that would probably be the easiest way to get to at least all the NERDA related trustees.
Okay.
What about grid C, where we have all the data that was collected throughout the GoMRI?
Yeah.
Grid C.
Yeah, I was saying earlier too.
That has, this will facilitate integration, because you'll see everything that is available as far as data and models and so on and so forth. It's called Grid C.
Greed?
No, not Grid with double I. Sorry.
Oh, Grid C.
No, I don't know. Grid is with two E's.
It has two I's.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Two I's. Sorry.
Two I's as well. Okay.
Two I's. Two I's. One D.
Yeah. Oh, 1D.
1D and then C. /C.
C as in SEA, the ocean.
No, just C,
or
like you
just
wrote
C.
it.
Yeah. Okay.
The letter C.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, great. Well, we're nominally out of time. I'm happy to stick around and talk with anybody who wants to stay, but I think we should declare victory for the moment. So this session will be followed up by a B session in a little less than a month, I think. We haven't scheduled them yet. In which we'll take the kind of the accumulation of the 4 A session calls, and we'll have that all mapped out in a hopefully more glorious and detailed manner, and we can talk about that further. So we'll get another chance to discuss these issues. Ron, is there anything on chat that we haven't addressed?
As far as I can see, there's various things on chat where people have said they have to go to another meeting and those kinds of things. Honestly, I'm not sure I've got it all, Tom.
Okay. Well, we'll copy and paste that and add it to our annotation as we wrap things up and report out on this meeting. So thank you everybody for participating. I thought it was a super interesting conversation, and I really look forward to taking this further.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
On a continuing basis, the question that I raise is, in the resilience question, is ultimately how to take all this knowledge and link it into the resilience network. And I guess that's, FEMA, EPA, if an issue occurs, like Deepwater Horizon again, how do we connect all of this information that's collected here into the response network to coordinate all of the institutions that have to respond, from hospitals to police and fire. Anyway, that was.
Yeah, it seems like there's kind of a large invisible college of all the possible respondents and decision makers who influence this system, and they're somehow interacting with pieces of this puzzle, and they may not even know that they're connected to all these other things, except in kind of a gut feeling way. So kind of reorganizing the world to respond more holistically is helpful and hard.
And hard, but I think there's some keen interest in that, and FEMA has a framework for community resilience. I think there's 7 dimensions to that, from police and fire to hospitals and health responders and all the rest I'm not remembering. It would be interesting to see how all of that connects into, because ultimately it seems like the output of all this has got to inform the process for the next event. Anyway.
Right.
Okay. Good job.
Thanks.
Yeah, right. I think it's great. Okay. I think everybody's gone, or is pretty much
getting there, I think. Yeah.
I think, hi, sorry, this is Emily from Sea Grant again.
Hi.
I think that to some degree, what you all were just talking about helping get that information out there before the next bill happens. We've been working with a lot of different groups within the different communities, like local organizations, but then also working with different people in the public health sector and also the emergency response community. So Sea Grant might be able to help facilitate some of those, I don't want to say facilitate those discussions in a formal way, but at least help connect some of those people with the information or connect different groups together.
Yeah, it seems like a natural role for you given your history with this. I mean, one of the elements of success in the stuff we did in California was that we had these meetings with the explicit understanding at the outset that we were not trying to arrive at some kind of consensus or a decision. So nobody was under any pressure to change their mind, and they didn't have to defend their turf explicitly. They could just talk and try to understand one another a little bit better. So I think there would be a lot of value to just getting people in the same room to talk about these things without any particular agenda, you know, to change a specific regulation or allocate money or whatever.
Yeah. I agree.
All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the good discussion.
It's an interesting thought to use Sea Grant.
Yeah.
As the vehicle to connect to other entities, the learning. Okay.
Yeah,
All right. Well, I'm going to pull the plug on the meeting. So everybody who's left, have a great day.
Thanks. You too.
Bye.
Thanks, Tom.